The silent suffering. Zira sat alone in the corner of the schoolyard, her blue skin and silver eyes, the only thing that made her stand out among the students. Her alien features were a constant source of teasing and cruel laughter. No matter how hard she tried to fit in, she always felt like an outsider, a stranger on a planet that didn't seem to want her. Each day, it was the same. The whispers behind her back, the pointed fingers, the sneering faces. She had learned to ignore the laughter, to pretend she didn't hear the hurtful words. But deep down, it hurt. Every insult, every glare, pierced through her like 1,000 sharp knives. And there was never anyone to stand up for her. Zira had tried to make friends, but her attempts were always met with rejection. No one wanted to be seen with the alien girl. They were too scared of what others might think. So Zira spent her days in silence, hiding in the shadows, away from the cruel eyes that followed her wherever she went. She told herself it didn't matter, that it didn't hurt. But it did. It hurt more than she could ever explain. Today was no different. As Zira walked through the crowded hallway, she could feel the eyes on her. A group of students whispered to each other, their words barely audible, but she knew what they were saying. "Why does she even come here?" One of them sneered. "She's so weird. No one wants her here." Another voice joined in, mocking her appearance. "Look at her skin. It's like she's from another planet." "Wait, she is." The laughter that followed stung like a slap to the face. Zira kept her head down, pretending she didn't hear. She had learned to be invisible, but it was getting harder and harder. The pain was becoming too much to bear. Why did she even come to this school? Why did she think, for just a moment, that she could belong? As Zira made her way to her next class, she caught sight of the other students standing in small groups, laughing and talking as if they were in their own world. She walked past them, her heart heavy, feeling like she was intruding. She found an empty seat at the back of the classroom, where she always sat. There, she would disappear. There, no one would see her. The bell rang, signaling the start of the lesson, but Zira didn't really hear it. She couldn't focus on the teacher's words. Instead, her mind wandered to thoughts of home, of her home planet, far away from this cruel place. She missed the stars, the quiet beauty of her world. She missed the warmth of her people, who never made her feel like an outcast. She sighed softly, wishing she could leave, but she couldn't. She was stuck here, trapped on this foreign planet, surrounded by people who didn't understand her, who didn't want to understand her. Her heart sank as she glanced around the room. The students were all talking in hushed voices, stealing glances at her every now and then. She could feel their eyes on her again, and she knew what they were thinking. Why is she here? She doesn't belong. As the lesson continued, Zira couldn't stop herself from looking around the room. Everyone seemed to be busy with their own conversations, but one boy caught her eye. He was sitting at the desk closest to hers. He had dark brown hair and bright green eyes that seemed to look right through her. Ethan. She had seen him around before, but he never seemed to notice her. He was always so involved in his own world, his friends laughing and joking with him. He never once looked her way. But today, for some reason, he was staring at her. Zira quickly turned her gaze back to the front of the room, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan's eyes were still on her. Why was he looking at her? What did he want? For a moment, Zira's heart beat faster, and a wave of hope rushed through her. Could he be different? Could he see her for who she was, not just some alien freak? She immediately pushed the thought away. No, it was just her imagination. No one cared about her. No one ever would. The rest of the lesson dragged on, and Zira tried her best to ignore the feeling that had settled in her chest. She couldn't afford to hope anymore. Not after all the times she had been let down. She had learned the hard way that no one would stand up for her. No one would ever be her friend. When the bell rang to end the class, Zira quickly gathered her things, eager to leave before the students could start whispering again. She stood up, clutching her books tightly to her chest, but as she turned to leave, she found herself face to face with Evan. His green eyes met hers, and for a moment, everything around them seemed to disappear. The noise of the classroom, the whispers from the other students, everything faded away. Ethan's lips parted, as if he was about to say something, but then he hesitated, glancing at her in a way that made Zira's heart skip a beat. She froze, waiting for him to say something, anything. But before she could get her hopes up, he simply walked past her, heading for the door. Zira let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She forced herself to turn away, to ignore the sting in her chest. It was nothing. Just another moment that would fade into the sea of countless others. She wasn't important to him, and she never would be. As she left the classroom, Zira looked out the window. The sky was gray, but somehow it felt like it was mocking her, reminding her that she was just one tiny speck on a vast, uncaring world. But then, as she stepped into the hallway, something unexpected happened. Ethan turned back around, walking toward her again. This time, he didn't hesitate. "Hey," he said softly, his voice warm. "Mind if I sit with you?" Zira's heart raced. Could this really be happening? A glimpse of hope. Ethan's words hung in the air for a moment, and Zira stared at him, unsure whether she had heard him correctly. "Mind if I sit with you?" he asked again, his voice calm and sincere. His bright green eyes were looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. Not judgment, not mockery, but curiosity. And maybe something else. Was it kindness? For a moment, Zira was frozen, her mind spinning. She had never been asked that question before. No one had ever cared enough to sit with her, especially not someone like Ethan. He was popular, funny, and always surrounded by friends. Why would he want to sit with her, the alien girl no one else dared to talk to? She blinked, trying to shake off the feeling of disbelief. Sure," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She quickly moved her books aside, making room for him at the empty seat next to hers. Ethan smiled, a friendly, genuine smile, and sat down beside her. His presence felt like a breath of fresh air, so different from the cold, cruel atmosphere Zira was used to. She had always kept to herself, never daring to engage with anyone, but for some reason, sitting next to Ethan didn't feel like a burden. It felt different. Zira glanced at him, unsure of what to say. The silence between them was awkward at first. She didn't know how to talk to him. She had spent so much time in isolation that social interactions had become foreign to her. She didn't know what normal conversation was like. She wanted to say something, anything, but her mind was racing with doubt. What if I say something wrong? What if he regrets sitting here with me? But Ethan didn't seem to mind the silence. He simply smiled again, looking out the window for a moment before turning back to her. "So, you're new here, right?" he asked casually, breaking the silence. His voice was warm, making Zira feel at ease for the first time in a long while. Zira nodded, a little hesitant. "Yeah, I've been here for a while now. I don't really fit in," she said softly, her voice barely audible. She felt embarrassed, but she couldn't stop herself. It was the truth. She never felt like she fit in anywhere. Ethan didn't seem to judge her for it. Instead, he looked thoughtful for a moment, his eyes focused on her. "You know, I get that. I've never really fit in either," he said, his voice kind and understanding. "I've always been the odd one out, the one who doesn't follow the crowd. But I don't mind it." Zira blinked, surprised by his words. He doesn't fit in either. She had always assumed that people like Ethan, the popular ones, never struggled with fitting in. But here he was, admitting it without hesitation. "You're not like the others," Zira said before she could stop herself, her voice quiet but sincere. She immediately felt awkward for saying it, but Ethan only smiled. "I guess that's one way to put it," he chuckled. "But hey, I don't mind being different. I'd rather be myself than try to be someone I'm not. Don't you think?" Zira felt a small spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was strange, this feeling of someone actually understanding her. She had always been taught to keep her emotions locked inside, to never show how much she longed for connection. But sitting next to Ethan, something in her felt lighter. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that things could change. The bell rang, signaling the end of the class, and the students began to pack up their things. Zira stood up, unsure of what to do next. But before she could grab her books, Ethan looked at her again, his smile never fading. "Hey, would you like to hang out after school? We could grab some lunch or something," he suggested casually, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Zira was stunned. He wants to spend time with me. Her heart raced at the thought. She had never been asked to hang out by anyone before, ever. The idea seemed so simple, yet so overwhelming. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should take the leap. What if it was just a one-time thing? What if she made a fool of herself? But then she remembered how kind he had been, how he hadn't judged her like everyone else. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a choice, like she had a chance to do something different. I'd like that," she said, her voice a little shaky but determined. "I'd like that a lot." Ethan's smile widened, and Zira couldn't help but smile back, even if it felt a little uncertain. For the first time in a long time, Zira didn't feel so alone. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. As the students filed out of the classroom, Zira and Ethan walked together, side by side. For once, she didn't feel the weight of the stares or the cruel words that usually followed her. With Ethan beside her, it was as if the world around them faded away. In that moment, it felt like anything was possible. And maybe, just maybe, it was the first move. The days that followed were different. Zira could hardly believe it. For the first time since she had arrived on this strange planet, someone had genuinely reached out to her. Ethan had become a part of her routine, and though the other students still whispered behind her back, Zira no longer felt completely alone. Each lunch period, Ethan would sit with her in the corner of the cafeteria. It wasn't the best place. Other students often passed by and glanced at them with curious, sometimes judgmental eyes. But it was enough. Ethan's presence was comforting, like a shield against the harshness of the world. And though he had only just begun to reach out, Zira could feel the change inside her. She wasn't just the alien girl anymore. She was Zira, a girl with a name, with someone who cared. That day, however, things were different. Zira had heard whispers in the halls, cruel whispers aimed at her. It wasn't the first time, but today they felt louder, sharper. What's she even doing with him? Someone had asked, their voice filled with disgust. Doesn't he know she's an alien? Another had chimed in. Zira lowered her head, trying to block out the sound of their words, but the hurt still cut deep. When the lunch bell rang, she waited anxiously, wondering if Ethan would still sit with her. She was used to being ignored or rejected, but something told her that Ethan was different. As soon as the bell rang, she spotted him across the cafeteria, and their eyes met. She felt a brief surge of hope. And then, with a quick, confident stride, Ethan made his way toward her. "Hey, Zira," he said with a smile, as if nothing was wrong, ready for another day of trying to survive cafeteria food. Zira couldn't help but smile back, her heart lifting in her chest. "I think I'm getting used to it," she said, her voice a little more confident than usual. She had grown comfortable with Ethan's company, but she still couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. What if the others started turning against him too? Ethan set his tray down next to hers and began unpacking his lunch. As they ate, the usual chatter and laughter from the surrounding tables filled the air, but Zira barely noticed. She was too focused on the quiet warmth of Ethan's presence. But then, just as Zira was about to relax, a voice interrupted their peaceful lunch. "You know, Ethan," a boy from the nearby table called out, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You're really brave, sitting with her. I mean, who would have thought you'd actually be friends with her?" The comment stung, but Zira tried to ignore it. focusing on her food. She had dealt with worse, but the look on Ethan's face told her everything. His brow furrowed in frustration, his hands tightening around his fork. Zira could see the tension building in him, as if he were about to snap. "Why don't you mind your own business, Troy?" Ethan said, his voice firm, but not raised. "You don't know her, so maybe you should keep your opinions to yourself." Zira's heart skipped a beat. Ethan had defended her. He didn't even hesitate. She had never been defended like this before, and it made her feel a mix of emotions: gratitude, surprise, and something deeper, something she wasn't ready to admit yet. The group at the other table fell silent, and Troy, who had been the one to speak, stared at Ethan with a look of disbelief. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to say something else, but then he just snorted and turned away. "Whatever," he muttered, and the conversation at the table shifted, leaving Ethan and Zira alone once again. Zira turned to him, her eyes wide. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice quieter than usual. Ethan shrugged, taking a bite of his sandwich. "I don't like bullies," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "And besides, you're my friend, Zira. No one's gonna talk about you like that while I'm around." Zira's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and something more, a feeling she hadn't experienced in so long. It was warmth, something that had been missing from her life for years. Ethan had shown her kindness when no one else had, and now, in this small moment, she felt like she might finally belong. The rest of the lunch passed quietly, and soon the bell rang, signaling the end of the break. Zira stood up, gathering her things, but she found herself reluctant to leave Ethan's side. For the first time, she didn't dread going back to class. She wasn't looking forward to it, but she didn't feel completely alone anymore. "Thanks," she said quietly as they walked toward their next class. Ethan glanced at her and smiled again, that same easygoing smile that always seemed to put her at ease. "No need to thank me. We've got each other's backs, right?" Zira nodded, her heart beating faster. There was something in Ethan's words that made her believe it, something in the way he looked at her that made her think maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, Zira let herself believe that things could be different. As they walked down the hall together, side by side, Zira couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Hope that maybe the world wasn't as dark and lonely as it had seemed before. Maybe, with Ethan by her side, she could finally stand tall and face whatever challenges came her way. A moment of courage. The following days seemed like a whirlwind. Zira could hardly keep up with the shift in her own feelings. For so long, she had been isolated, floating through each school day with a sense of dread that never seemed to leave. But now, something was different. With Ethan by her side, she felt a spark of courage she had never known before. Each day, she was starting to feel a little less like an outsider. It wasn't perfect, though. The whispers were still there. Some students had started to give her strange looks, as if her friendship with Ethan made her an even bigger mystery to them. But for the first time in her life, Zira didn't care. She was learning that some things were more important than fitting in. Being herself, being seen for who she truly was something that mattered more than the cruel opinions of others. Today, however, was different. Zira had never felt this nervous before. She had heard through the grapevine that some of the students were planning to confront Ethan about his choice to sit with her. The rumors had been spreading for days, whispers that he was losing his status because of his association with the alien girl. Zira wasn't worried for herself. She had learned to take the harsh words in stride. But Ethan, she didn't want him to get caught in the middle of their cruelty. He didn't deserve it. As she sat down at the back of the class, Zira glanced around, scanning the room for Ethan. He wasn't here yet. Her stomach twisted with nerves. What if today was the day everything changed? What if his friends turned on him? What if he started doubting their friendship? She couldn't bear the thought of losing the only person who had shown her kindness since she'd come to this planet. The door to the classroom opened, and Ethan walked in, his usual confident stride making her heart skip a beat. He glanced around the room and spotted her at the back. His face immediately softened into a smile, and Zira felt her nerves ease just a little. He walked over to her, as he always did, and sat down next to her, his backpack thumping on the floor. "Hey," he said casually, giving her a grin. "Ready to survive another day?" Zira smiled back, feeling a little lighter at his presence. "I guess so," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. But just as she thought the moment would pass without incident, the door to the classroom opened again. A group of students, led by Troy, walked in, their eyes immediately locking on Ethan and Zira. Zira's heart sank. She could feel the tension in the air, a crackling energy that made her stomach twist. Ethan noticed too. His posture stiffened as Troy and his friends took their seats. Zira tried to ignore them, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The class began, but it wasn't long before Troy leaned forward, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the classroom. "Hey, Ethan," he called, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You really think it's a good idea to hang out with her?" Zira felt the blood drain from her face. She looked over at Ethan, her breath catching in her throat. Ethan didn't say anything at first, just stared at Troy, his eyes hard. But Zira could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fists clenched on his desk. "Why does it matter to you?" Ethan finally said, his voice calm, but Zira could hear the edge beneath it. Troy smirked, looking over at his friends for support. "It matters because she's not one of us, Ethan," he said with a sneer. "You're letting this alien girl drag you down. Don't you see? You're losing everything because of her." The words hit Zira like a physical blow. She could feel her chest tighten, her throat closing. She didn't care about herself anymore. But Ethan, he didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to be dragged into her mess. She wanted to look away, to hide. But instead, something inside her snapped. She stood up, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice firm. "Ethan's right," she said, her voice louder than she intended. "It doesn't matter who I am. I'm still a person. And Ethan's my friend. No one should be ashamed of that." The classroom fell silent. Zira's heart pounded in her chest as she realized she had spoken out loud, in front of everyone. The whispers, the laughter, they all came to a halt as the room focused on her. Troy stared at her, his expression twisting into something unrecognizable. Anger, disbelief, maybe even a bit of fear. "You're delusional, alien," he spat, his words venomous. "You'll never be one of us. No one wants you here." But Zira didn't flinch. She stood her ground, meeting his gaze with as much strength as she could muster. "I don't need to be one of you. I don't need anyone to accept me. But I won't let you bully me or anyone else, just because you're too scared to open your mind." For a moment, everything was still. Even the air seemed to freeze, and Zira felt her breath catch in her throat. Had she gone too far? Was this the moment that everything would fall apart? But then, Ethan stood up beside her. His presence, as always, was a calming force. "She's right," he said, his voice steady. "You don't get to decide who we are or who we can be friends with." The room remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Troy's face was red with anger, but he didn't say anything more. Slowly, his group began to gather their things, looking uncomfortable. It was clear that they weren't expecting Ethan and Zira to stand up to them. With a muttered curse, Troy and his friends left the room, grumbling under their breath. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the classroom slowly began to fade. Zira looked over at Ethan, her heart racing. "Thanks," she said softly, feeling a rush of relief. Ethan gave her a small smile. "No need to thank me," he replied. "We've got this." Zira felt a weight lift off her shoulders. In that moment, she realized something important. She wasn't alone. And as long as Ethan was by her side, she wasn't going to let anyone push her around ever again. This was her time to stand tall. This was her moment. The turning point. The days after the confrontation in class were tense, but Zira felt a shift in the air around her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not just for her, but for everyone around her. After that moment in class when she had stood up to Troy, a small ripple of change had spread. It was subtle, but it was there. The whispers, the stares, they hadn't stopped, but Zira noticed something different. It wasn't just pity or mockery anymore. Some students had started to look at her differently, as if they were actually seeing her, the person behind the alien exterior. And Ethan seemed to be more protective than ever. He made a point of walking with her to every class, sitting with her at lunch, and checking in on her between periods. Zira had never experienced anything like it, and the more time she spent with him, the more she realized something she had never allowed herself to admit. She was beginning to care about him, more than just as a friend. But Zira wasn't sure how to process these new feelings. She had always kept her distance from others, kept her emotions locked away behind a wall. But with Ethan, she felt that wall beginning to crumble, brick by brick. Today, things felt different again. Zira walked into the classroom early, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She had something to say to Ethan, something she hadn't been able to find the words for. She had always been so afraid of opening up, of being vulnerable. But Ethan had shown her kindness, courage, and a level of understanding she had never known before. It was time to take a step forward, to be honest with him, to let him know just how much his friendship meant to her. She sat at her desk, her hands trembling slightly. She could hear the sound of students trickling in, but she kept her gaze focused on her desk, the fluttering of her heart growing with each passing second. Then the door opened, and there he was, Ethan, as always, walking into the room with his confident stride. He smiled when he saw her, and it made Zira's heart flutter in her chest. He didn't say anything at first, but when he walked over to her desk, there was something in his eyes, a quiet understanding, a connection that Zira couldn't quite explain. "Hey," he said, sitting down beside her. "How are you doing today?" Zira took a deep breath. This was it. She had to say something, even if it felt like her heart was going to beat out of her chest. She turned to him, her voice soft but determined. "Ethan, I want to thank you." He raised an eyebrow, a surprised expression crossing his face. "For what?" "For everything," she said, her words coming out more quickly now. "For sitting with me, for standing up for me, for being my friend when no one else would. You've done more for me than anyone ever has. And I just want you to know that I'm grateful." Ethan stared at her for a moment, his eyes softening, before he smiled again. "You don't need to thank me. I do it because I want to. You're my friend, Zira, and friends take care of each other." Zira's heart skipped a beat at his words. Friend. It was such a simple word, but it carried so much weight. For the first time, Zira felt like she truly belonged, like she wasn't just an outsider anymore. But just as she was about to say more, the door to the classroom opened again, and Troy walked in with his usual entourage of friends. Zira tensed immediately, but this time, she didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let them see her nervous. She wasn't going to let them control the way she felt anymore. Troy didn't even glance at her as he walked past, but his eyes locked onto Ethan's. "You're still hanging out with the alien girl," he sneered. "I thought maybe you'd realize what a mistake you're making, but I guess you're just as dumb as she is." Zira felt her blood boil at the words, but this time she didn't feel scared. She felt angry. No one was going to call her dumb. No one was going to make her feel less than anyone else. Before she could stop herself, she stood up from her desk. Her voice was calm, but there was fire behind it. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Troy," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not dumb. I'm not a mistake. And neither is Ethan. We don't need you or anyone else to tell us who we are." Troy sneered again, but instead of responding, he turned his back and walked away with his friends, muttering under his breath. Zira felt a surge of pride wash over her. She had done it. She had stood up for herself and Ethan, and she hadn't even flinched. As the class began, Zira sat back down, her heart still pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what she had just done. It felt like a victory, but more than that, it felt like something had finally clicked inside her. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And it was because of Ethan. Ethan turned to her, his face lit up with a proud smile. "That was awesome," he said quietly, his voice filled with approval. Zira blushed, but she couldn't stop the small smile that tugged at her lips. "Thanks," she replied softly. And as the class continued, Zira realized something important. She didn't need to hide anymore. She didn't need to pretend to be someone she wasn't. With Ethan by her side, she could be herself, and that was all she ever really needed. Unlikely allies. The school days that followed were a blur. The tension between Zira and the other students seemed to shift, but there was a sense of cautious respect in the air now. No one dared say anything too harsh to her face, but the whispered conversations in the hallways had grown quieter. It was as though the students were waiting for something, waiting to see if Zira would break or if Ethan would change his mind. But as the days passed, Zira began to notice something unexpected. Ethan wasn't the only one standing up for her anymore. Slowly, other students who had once ignored her, or worse, laughed at her, started to show signs of solidarity. It began with small gestures. People holding the door open for her, nodding in her direction as she passed. Then, one morning in the cafeteria, a girl named Maya, who Zira had always thought of as one of the popular girls, approached her table. She didn't sit down at first, but the way she hesitated, glancing between Zira and the group she usually sat with, was enough to catch her attention. "Hey, Zira," Maya said, her voice uncertain but kind. I wanted to apologize for, how people have treated you." Zira blinked in surprise. She had never expected anyone like Maya to come forward. Maya was one of the students who had always kept her distance, and in Zira's mind, she had been just as guilty as the others of turning a blind eye. But now, here she was, offering an apology. It's okay," Zira said, her voice a little quieter than she intended. "You didn't really do anything." Maya shook her head. "No, but I didn't do anything to stop it either. And I should have. I don't think you deserve any of it. I just wanted you to know that." The words felt like a weight had been lifted from Zira's shoulders. Maya's apology wasn't going to fix everything. It didn't erase the past. But it meant something. It meant that maybe, just maybe, the world was starting to change. And with that change, there was hope. From that day forward, Maya began sitting with Zira at lunch, and soon a few other students joined them as well. It wasn't a large group, but it was enough to make a difference. Ethan's friends, too, started to come around. No one ever made a big deal about it, but there was an unspoken understanding. Zira wasn't the outsider anymore. She wasn't the alien girl that everyone ignored. She was Zira, and she was part of their school now. But even with the new acceptance, the fear that Zira had buried deep within her still lingered. She had been hurt before, rejected, cast aside. And the possibility of that happening again was a thought she couldn't shake, especially when she saw Troy and his friends lingering at the edges of the cafeteria, whispering among themselves. Zira had learned to ignore them, to rise above their cruelty. But something about the way they watched her made her uneasy. She couldn't quite place it, but the feeling of being watched was unsettling. One afternoon, as she and Ethan walked to class together, Zira couldn't hold it in any longer. "Ethan, do you think they're just waiting for me to fail? Waiting for me to mess up so they can say, 'I told you so'?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan, who had been walking a step ahead of her, stopped and turned to face her. His expression was serious, but there was a warmth in his eyes that made Zira feel safe. "Zira, I don't know what's going on in their heads, but I do know this. They don't matter. You matter. You've already proven yourself to me, and to everyone else who's willing to see you for who you really are." Zira swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "But I'm not like them. I don't belong here, Ethan. I'm not from this planet. I'm an alien, and they'll never let me forget that. Ethan reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. You're not just an alien. You're Zira, and you belong here as much as anyone else. The more you stand tall, the more they'll have to see you for who you are. And eventually, they'll have no choice but to accept it. Zira looked up at him, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe it. Maybe she didn't have to keep proving herself. Maybe she could just be Zira. As the days passed, the rumors and whispers slowly started to fade. The students who had once shunned her began to treat her with a newfound respect. They still avoided the topic of her being an alien, but it no longer mattered. She had found her place in the school, and more importantly, she had found herself. Then one day after school, as Zira was packing her bag, she heard a familiar voice. Hey Zira, you busy? She turned to find Maya standing at the door of the classroom, a hesitant but friendly smile on her face. Zira was surprised to see her there. Not really, Zira said, her eyebrows furrowing slightly. What's up? Maya hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Well, I know things haven't been easy for you, but I was wondering if you wanted to come hang out with us after school today. Maybe grab a coffee or something. Zira blinked in surprise, unsure if she had heard her right. Maya and her friends had always been on the outside of the group she now found herself a part of. But now Maya was asking her to join them. It was an invitation Zira had never expected, and for a moment she couldn't believe it. But then, looking at Maya's hopeful face, Zira realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Ethan, she had Maya, and she had a group of students who were beginning to see her for who she truly was. Zira smiled, a genuine smile, one she hadn't worn in a long time. Yeah, I'd like that. And with that simple invitation, Zira felt the last of her doubts begin to fade away. She was no longer an outsider. She was part of something, a small group, but a group that accepted her for who she was, and that was all that mattered. As she walked out of the classroom with Maya, her heart felt light. For the first time in a long time, Zira allowed herself to believe in something better. And as the sun set over the horizon, she knew this was only the beginning. The world had a lot to learn about her, and she was ready to show them. Standing together, the weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Zira, once the quiet alien girl in the corner, had become an integral part of the school's changing dynamic. She was no longer the outcast, but a student like everyone else, with her own friends and her own place in the world. Ethan stood by her side, as supportive as ever, but it wasn't just him anymore. Maya, and even some of the students who had once kept their distance, were now actively including her in their lives. But there was still one question that haunted Zira's mind. What about Troy? He and his friends still lurked around, their disdain for her as apparent as ever. They had tried their best to provoke her, to break her down, but Zira hadn't wavered. She had learned to walk tall, to hold her head high, and she wasn't about to let them ruin the progress she had made. One day, after school, Zira and Ethan were walking to the parking lot when Troy and his friends appeared in front of them. The group of jocks stood in their way, their eyes narrowed, and the tension in the air was thick. Still hanging around with the alien freak, Troy sneered, looking directly at Ethan. You must be out of your mind. Zira felt her stomach churn, but instead of letting the anger rise up in her, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, standing beside Ethan. The time for fear and doubt had passed. She was done hiding. I'm not an alien freak, she said, her voice calm but firm. I'm Zira, and I don't need your approval to be who I am. As the days passed, the rumors and whispers slowly started to fade. The students who had once shunned her began to treat her with a newfound respect. They still avoided the topic of her being an alien, but it no longer mattered. She had found her place in the school, and more importantly, she had found herself. Then one day after school, as Zira was packing her bag, she heard a familiar voice. Hey Zira, you busy? She turned to find Maya standing at the door of the classroom, a hesitant but friendly smile on her face. Zira was surprised to see her there. Not really, Zira said, her eyebrows furrowing slightly. What's up? Maya hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Well, I know things haven't been easy for you, but I was wondering if you wanted to come hang out with us after school today. Maybe grab a coffee or something. Zira blinked in surprise, unsure if she had heard her right. Maya and her friends had always been on the outside of the group she now found herself a part of. But now Maya was asking her to join them. It was an invitation Zira had never expected. And for a moment, she couldn't believe it. But then, looking at Maya's hopeful face, Zira realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Ethan, she had Maya, and she had a group of students who were beginning to see her for who she truly was. Zira smiled, a genuine smile, one she hadn't worn in a long time. Yeah, I'd like that. And with that simple invitation, Zira felt the last of her doubts begin to fade away. She was no longer an outsider. She was part of something, a small group, but a group that accepted her for who she was, and that was all that mattered. As she walked out of the classroom with Maya, her heart felt light. For the first time in a long time, Zira allowed herself to believe in something better. And as the sun set over the horizon, she knew this was only the beginning. The world had a lot to learn about her, and she was ready to show them. Standing together. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Zira, once the quiet alien girl in the corner, had become an integral part of the school's changing dynamic. She was no longer the outcast, but a student like everyone else, with her own friends and her own place in the world. Ethan stood by her side, as supportive as ever, but it wasn't just him anymore. Maya, and even some of the students who had once kept their distance, were now actively including her in their lives. But there was still one question that haunted Zira's mind. What about Troy? He and his friends still lurked around, their disdain for her as apparent as ever. They had tried their best to provoke her, to break her down, but Zira hadn't wavered. She had learned to walk tall, to hold her head high, and she wasn't about to let them ruin the progress she had made. One day, after school, Zira and Ethan were walking to the parking lot when Troy and his friends appeared in front of them. The group of jocks stood in their way, their eyes narrowed, and the tension in the air was thick. Still hanging around with the alien freak, Troy sneered, looking directly at Ethan. You must be out of your mind. Zira felt her stomach churn, but instead of letting the anger rise up in her, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, standing beside Ethan. The time for fear and doubt had passed. She was done hiding. I'm not an alien freak, she said, her voice calm but firm. I'm Zira, and I don't need your approval to be who I am.